Casual Scholar is a quickly growing YouTube channel that makes videos about politics. In the course of less than 2 years and only 17 videos, his channel's gotten 200,000 subscribers. In this video, I'm going to talk about two of Scholar's videos, both of which are extremely dishonest. And yeah, no, I'm not even going to take the bait and watch this video. I just won't. I refuse. I finished the script before it even came out anyways, and I just refuse to watch it. First, let's start with this video, Why Latin America is Poor, where he lays out his argument for why Latin America is poor, surprise surprise, while the US is rich. I'm going to spare going through the video step by step, but basically after listening to a lot of economic mumbo-jumbo that is incredibly sleep-inducing, you can sum up his argument as, the American political system is not corrupt because they have a functioning democratic system where politicians are held accountable by voters, but in Latin America the democracies are far too corrupt to function properly. Why are they so corrupt? Well, watching the video you definitely wouldn't get the sense that the US had anything to do with it. Many of the comments basically parrot Casual Scholar's remarkable admission of a very large part of Latin American history, agreeing with him that corruption is to blame, without any of them in any way seeming to want to address why Latin America might have issues with corruption in the first place. Ignoring the fact that the US itself is an extraordinarily corrupt country, except that most of the corruption is legalized through lobbying and super PACs, so it's not technically considered quote-unquote corruption, this shows just how effective Western propaganda has been on putting the blame for the ills of Latin America not on the US, but on the countries themselves. The video briefly mentions colonialism under Spain, but completely neglects to acknowledge neocolonialism or neo-imperialism and the fundamental role the US has played for over a century in keeping Latin America poor in the first place. The US has done far, far more damage to Latin America than Latin America could have ever managed to do to itself. I wrote a very long script first, describing in detail each and every one of the military interventions the US has launched in Latin America. But plenty of people have already talked about this in depth to the point that going over it in detail again would just be a waste of time for people who are already aware. So instead, if you want more detail, you can click the Google Doc in the description to see the original part of the script where I talk about each of these coups in more detail, or you can read a book like Killing Hope by William Blum, or you can just look at these graphics that illustrate it. Now, while most people have at least heard of the US's many coups in Latin America, what less people are aware of is the methods the US uses to make a country subservient to them without actual military action, from embargoes to an idea called shock therapy. This is how shock therapy works. The International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, both financial institutions which the US has a very large amount of influence in, promises a country a loan, but only if that country performs what are called structural adjustments. What this entails is cutting welfare, increasing worker hours and lowering worker wages, and many other actions that serve to give America a cheap labor force to export goods and materials to the first world with as little cost to the first world as possible. In other words, neocolonialism. As a good example, in 1952 there was a leftist revolution in Bolivia. But, quote, the following year the US took more direct authority over Bolivia's economy by imposing an economic stabilization program, which the Bolivian government agreed to, according to US officials, virtually under duress. The program, which bore striking resemblance to the structural adjustment programs which have since been imposed on dozens of debt-ridden countries in Latin America and elsewhere, consisted of the devaluation of Bolivia's currency, an end to export-import controls, price controls, and government subsidies on consumer goods, the freezing of wages and salaries, major cutbacks in spending for education and social welfare, and an end to efforts at industrial diversification. The result, according to US officials, which forced its implementation, meant the repudiation, at least tacitly, of virtually everything that the revolutionary government had done over the previous 4 years. It not only redirected the economic priorities of the revolution, particularly its efforts at economic diversification, but altered the revolution's political structure by effectively curbing the power of the trade unions and displacing socialist-leaning leaders of the MNR. As the article mentions, this has happened to some extent to practically every country in South America, either peacefully or through force, and still is. These problems aren't just set in the past. The mines and natural resources of many of these countries are still owned by Western corporations as a result of coups or the IMF and World Bank structural adjustments. Therefore, as can be seen, Latin America's ills are thanks to a lot more than just the corruption of its officials. Once in the American Revolution, the US fought for the independence from a foreign power that was exploiting it. Now the US is that foreign power. Casual Scholar masks himself as this educational, historical, neutral channel when it really is basically just CIA propaganda. Yes, the video itself never mentions the CIA, but that's exactly the point. It is CIA propaganda, specifically because it never mentions the huge role the CIA played in exploiting South America, not to mention what America did to the country even before the CIA ever existed. It's hard to see Casual Scholar's video as simply being a naive, misinformed analysis because he's specifically comparing Latin America to the United States. Imagine just for a moment if, without many people's knowledge, Russia invaded the US, deposed the government by killing or exiling most people who supported the democracy there, then installed an authoritarian far-right dictator who killed and repressed any protesters and enriched himself and his friends with billions of dollars. Then imagine a YouTuber from Russia 30 years later makes a video talking about how the US was in such a bad state because of how corrupt its politicians were, because it didn't have Russian values of freedom and democracy, while also at the same time ignoring the fact that Russia itself is exceptionally corrupt. I don't think the question of whether this guy is some kind of op really matters. Perhaps as many defenders of American interventionism are, he isn't directly funded by any interests, but is just a relative of a former CIA op or someone similar, or maybe he's just some racist neocon in his mother's basement who somehow happens to have extremely professional production value to his videos. Who knows? Regardless of whether or not he's actually independent, I just find it hard not to believe that this isn't a deliberate and very purposeful attempt to absolve the US of its own blame by creating an extremely narrow and dishonest picture of history. Of course, it gets even worse. To get an idea of the sheer extent as to how dishonest Casual Scholar is, let's now compare that video to his video Why Africa Will Remain Poor. The video is more really about China than about Africa. What is his argument? Well, basically, he argues that the reason Africa will remain poor is because China is building airports, docks, roads, and railways in Africa. No, I'm 100% serious. This is literally what he says. More specifically, Casual Scholar argues that China is drowning Africa in debt by building infrastructure in these countries. Let's just ignore that he doesn't mention how Africa is poor in the first place, how the IMF and World Bank were actually the institutions that drain these countries dry through loans that immerse the countries in debt for decades. Let's also ignore that he never mentions the ravages of colonialism in Africa by the European powers, or how the US helped commit coups or support coup members in the Belgian Congo, Egypt, Angola, Chad, and in Libya, and installed right-wing dictators loyal to the West in their place. Let's just actually in good faith examine his specific claim that China is immersing these African countries in debt through loan. Oh wait, well, that's awkward. Comparing the way the West has treated Africa throughout its history compared to how China has treated Africa, we can see that China's relationship with Africa is not nearly as predatory. The IMF occasionally cancels its own loans, but remember that not only did the Chinese loans get cancels, but they also had none of the prerequisite requirements that the IMF and World Bank loans did to force countries to neoliberalize their economies for the sake of the first world. China builds a lot of the things it does itself rather than just the IMF giving politicians money and hoping they build things only for the money to disappear. That's because the IMF only cares about giving the loans. Once Africa takes the loan, the IMF doesn't really care what Africa does with that money. In fact, the more poorly the funds are used, the better for organizations like the IMF, as that means the country may struggle to pay its debt, and thus have to pay more and more in interest and be forever indebted. China isn't necessarily being good for the sake of it. It's just a tactical move. Actually helping these countries long-term builds goodwill and makes these countries more unlikely to work with the West, giving China more access to their economies, which will be better able to grow and develop without being saddled with crippling loans. In the 1990s, when Africa was ravaged by civil wars, coups, and genocides, European nations were busy funding militias and causing instability in the background, while portraying Africa as some backwater pit of the earth that people should feel sorry for. While this was the Western stance, China had just emerged from abject poverty itself in some ways, and understood what the young African countries were going through. China understands that Africa doesn't need aid and pity, they needed infrastructure. There's a lot more pushback against Casual Scholar's bullshit in the Africa video than there is in the Latin America video at least, which is really good to see. And for good reason, the video itself is riddled with basic factual errors. He says Kenya is south of Uganda, but it's actually to the east. And he also says Mombasa is the largest port in Africa when it's actually Port Durban. One of his main examples of the failures of China's debt trap diplomacy, that the Kenya-Mombasa to Nairobi railroad was left unfinished, is also just wrong. It has been finished and even extended further, and a plan to have it reach another city was halted due to lack of funding. So he just gets so many things wrong, and it just shows how little he cares about Africa beyond just pushing the China bad narrative. Casual Scholar isn't the only channel spouting ridiculous crap like this. He's just one of countless terrible right-wing history channels that just happen to have really good production value. But this video in particular reflects the shift of American Sino relations to establishing China as the new USSR, the new great enemy. And as China seems set to become the new world superpower, Casual Scholar is just a small part of a large and growing trend of channels demonizing China at all costs, while doing everything in their power to make America seem virtuous in comparison. In short, Casual Scholar is a disgusting liar, and he knows it, and if he really has even the slightest backbone, he should take down these videos and apologize for being a shameless, spineless propagandist for imperialism, and also for almost certainly being a racist as well. Anyways, that's about all I have to say. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, or comment, and also follow me on Patreon if you want to financially support me so I can continue making these videos. Thank you also to my current patrons, Professional Tanky, Richard Scott Wigton, Alexander Birdston, and PyBot5000. Thanks for watching.